I told my girlfriend the truth the same night the snow started falling sideways, thick and loud against the windows like the city was trying to break in. I didn't plan to say it then. I didn't plan to say it at all. But she was laughing at something on her phone, careless and bright, and the sound scraped against my ribs until the words pushed themselves out of my mouth. I said there was someone else. I said I hadn't touched her. I said it didn't matter because it was real anyway. The silence that followed felt like a car accident you survive but don't come out of unchanged. Her name was Claire, and she stood up slowly, like any sudden movement might shatter her. "Online," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were bitter. I nodded. I watched the reflection of my own face in the dark television screen, pale and unrecognizable, like I'd already left my body. Claire didn't cry. She picked up her coat, wrapped her scarf once around her neck, and said she hoped it was worth it. The door closed with a sound that felt final, and I stood there listening to the heat click on and off, waiting for regret to arrive. What came instead was her. I hadn't even known what winter could do to a person until I met Rowan. We started talking because I was lonely in a way that didn't feel dramatic enough to explain to anyone. It was January, the kind that makes the sky look unfinished, and I was scrolling without thinking when her message appeared, simple and unguarded, like she'd knocked on the wrong door and decided to stay anyway. She lived 3 time zones away. She had a profile picture that didn't try to impress anyone. She asked questions that felt like she was listening even before I answered. We didn't fall into each other the way people like to say. It was slower, stranger. Some nights we talked until my phone overheated and shut itself off. Other nights we sent one message each and let the silence stretch without panic. She told me about the town she lived in, how the lake froze thick enough for people to walk across it, how the grocery store cashier knew everyone's business. I told her about the city, about the way the buses hissed in the cold, about how you could be surrounded by people and still feel like you were shouting into a void. She never flirted the way I expected. When she said I sounded tired, it wasn't an opening line. It was concern. When she told me she liked my laugh, it was in the middle of a conversation about grief, like it had slipped out without permission. I kept waiting for the moment it would tip into something obvious and therefore manageable. It never did. Instead, it sank into me quietly, the way cold does when you forget to zip your coat. Claire noticed before I did. She asked why I was smiling at my phone. She asked why I seemed elsewhere even when we were lying in bed, our legs tangled in familiar shapes. I told her work was stressful. I told her winter always did this to me. Those were true, but they weren't enough. The truth was that every time Rowan said my name, typed out carefully like it mattered, something inside me aligned. The truth was that I was starting to imagine a version of myself that existed in her presence, and I didn't know how to put that back in the box. Rowan never asked me to leave anything. That was the worst part. She knew about Claire. She asked about her in a way that wasn't probing, just factual, like she was mapping the terrain. She told me she didn't want to be a secret or a solution. She said she didn't know what she wanted, only what she wouldn't do. Boundaries spoken calmly can feel like a challenge when you're already leaning too far over the edge. The night I told Claire, Rowan was silent. I sent a message that said it happened, that I'd done it, that I was alone now in an apartment that smelled like winter coats and old coffee. She didn't reply right away. I stared at the screen, at the last thing she'd sent me earlier that evening, a picture of her window rimmed with frost. When her message finally came through, it was careful. She said she was sorry it hurt. She said she was scared of what this meant. She didn't say she was glad. February deepened everything. The city turned gray in a way that felt personal. Claire's side of the closet stayed empty. I learned the sound of my own footsteps at night. Rowan became both anchor and storm. We talked about music and childhood, and the way certain memories change shape when you look at them too long. We avoided talking about the future like it was a superstition. I told myself this was safer. I told myself distance made it impossible to ruin each other. Then she told me she was thinking about visiting. She said it like she was mentioning the weather, like it was something that could change by morning. My chest tightened in a way that wasn't fear exactly. I imagined her in my space, imagined the way her presence might rearrange me permanently. I imagined the end of something even as I leaned toward the beginning. I told her she could stay with me. The words felt enormous, irreversible. The weeks leading up to her arrival were full of small, electric moments. She asked what my apartment was like, and I found myself noticing things I'd never cared about before. The crack in the ceiling, the plant that refused to die. I cleaned like I was preparing a stage. We argued once unexpectedly about nothing important, and the intensity of it surprised us both. It passed quickly, leaving behind a residue of something like relief. Conflict meant this was real enough to risk. The day she arrived, the airport was chaos. Flights delayed, people sleeping on the floor, winter asserting itself with authority. I stood near the gate, hands shoved into my pockets, rehearsing neutrality. When I saw her, my first thought was that she looked smaller than I'd imagined, more contained. My second thought was that I'd been wrong about that. She spotted me and smiled, tentative, and the room seemed to tilt. We didn't hug right away. We stood there, two women pretending we were strangers, absorbing the fact of each other. When she finally stepped into my space, it was gentle, like she was checking whether I'd disappear. The contact was brief, appropriate, and it left my hands shaking. The days that followed were a careful dance. We walked through the city, pointed out things like tourists, ate soup in crowded places where our knees brushed under the table. At night we sat on opposite ends of the couch, a deliberate choice that felt both noble and absurd. The air between us hummed with unsaid things. I slept lightly, aware of her breathing down the hall, aware of how much restraint costs. On the fourth night, it snowed again, thick and slow, like the world was trying to quiet itself. We stood at the window, shoulder to shoulder, watching it fall. She said she couldn't do this forever, this hovering. She said she needed to know what I wanted, not eventually, but now. The question landed between us, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to answer, already knowing that whatever I said would change the year completely. I didn't answer her right away. The snow kept falling, thick enough to blur the streetlights into soft halos, and for a moment it felt like the city had granted me a pause I didn't deserve. Rowan waited without pushing, her arms crossed loosely, her posture open in a way that made it harder, not easier. I realized then that she wasn't asking for a promise. She was asking for honesty without protection. "I don't know how to want something without burning it down," I said finally. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "But I know I don't want this to disappear." She exhaled, slow, like she'd been holding her breath longer than I'd noticed. "That's not an answer," she said gently. "I know." She turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped between her knees. I followed, keeping distance like it was a rule we'd written together and forgotten how to revise. "I came here because I needed to know if what we have survives proximity," she said. "Not just screens and late-night honesty. Real life. Noise. Disappointment." The word disappointment settled into the room. I thought of Claire's coat by the door that night, the way she'd said my name like it was something she was giving back. I thought of how easy it would be to lie now, to say yes in a way that meant maybe later, to keep Rowan suspended in this almost space where no one gets hurt immediately. "I want to try," I said. The sentence felt too small for what it carried. "I want to see if this holds." Rowan nodded once. She didn't smile. "Okay," she said, "then we need to be careful." Careful became the shape of our days. We made coffee in the mornings without touching. We shared space like diplomats. When we talked about us, it was in abstract terms, as if naming things directly might make them breakable. She stayed longer than she'd planned. The lake back home froze solid without her. I watched the calendar change with a mix of hope and dread, every crossed-out day a small theft from whatever future I couldn't yet imagine. People noticed. My friend Maya asked who the woman was who kept appearing in my stories. My sister called and asked if I was okay, said I sounded different. Rowan met pieces of my life with a kind of quiet courage, never trying to take up more room than offered. The restraint was its own intimacy. It made everything else louder. One afternoon, we went to the bookstore near my apartment, the one with uneven floors and handwritten recommendations taped to the shelves. We wandered separately at first, like we always did, giving each other space to breathe. I found her in the poetry section, her finger tracing spines she didn't pull down. She looked up when she sensed me, her smile immediate, and then checked, like she remembered where we were. "This one changed my life," she said, holding up a slim book. "Or at least the way I think about time." I wanted to ask what else had changed her. I wanted to know what parts of her I'd only seen in outline. Instead, I nodded and said I'd add it to the pile. We stood there inches apart, and for a moment the restraint felt unbearable. I reached out without thinking and brushed snowmelt from her sleeve, an intimate nothing. She stilled, her eyes searching my face, and the world narrowed to the space between our hands. "I need to say something," she said softly, my heart thudded already bracing. "Okay. I got an offer," she said. "Before I came here, a job, it's good, it's there. There meant home, there meant distance made permanent by choice. I felt something tilt inside me, a recalibration I hadn't consented to. "When do you have to decide?" I asked. "Soon," she said. "They won't wait forever." We didn't talk about it again that day. The unsaid pressed against everything else, turning small moments sharp. That night, we sat on the floor with takeout cartons between us, the television on but unwatched. She laughed at something I said, then stopped abruptly, her expression clouding. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of choosing wrong." "So am I said, and meant more than one thing. The following week brought a thaw. Snow melted into slush, and the city smelled like damp metal and possibility. Rowan started packing slowly, methodically, folding clothes like she was practicing leaving. I pretended not to notice. I told myself this was the cost of being careful. I told myself love didn't require possession. On her last Friday, we went out for drinks with Maya and her partner. It was loud and warm and normal in a way that felt almost surreal. Maya liked Rowan immediately, which I'd expected and feared. They talked about books and bad bosses and the peculiar grief of moving away from places you never fully belonged to. Watching them, I felt both proud and exposed, like my interior life had been set on the table without my permission. In the cab home, Rowan leaned her head back, eyes closed. Her knee brushed mine with the rhythm of the road. The contact sent a jolt through me, sharp and unwelcome. I shifted slightly, and she noticed, her eyes opening. "Still careful?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. "I don't trust myself," I said. She smiled, small and sad. "I trust you," she said. The words landed like a responsibility I wasn't sure I could carry. That night we broke our rule. It wasn't dramatic. There was no confession, no sudden music cue. We were standing in the kitchen, the light too bright, talking about nothing. She reached for a glass, and our hands collided, fingers tangling reflexively. We froze, both of us aware that this was the moment we'd been circling. She didn't pull away, neither did I. "Tell me to stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss was brief, restrained even in its surrender, but it cracked something open that couldn't be resealed. We stepped back immediately, breathless and stunned by our own audacity. The room felt altered, charged in a way that made everything else feel irrelevant. "I don't regret that," she said. "Me neither," I said, and knew that meant consequences. The next morning she was quiet, not distant but thoughtful, like she was measuring something internal. I watched her drink her coffee, the familiar curve of her mouth now freighted with meaning. "I don't want to make promises we can't keep," she said eventually, "but I don't want to pretend that didn't matter." "It mattered," I said. The simplicity of it felt like truth stripped of ornament. Her flight was early Sunday. We stood in the security line, closer now than we'd been all week, the care replaced by something more honest and more dangerous. When it was time to part, she hugged me tightly, her face buried in my shoulder. "Whatever happens," she said into my coat, "this changed me." "Me too," I said, and watched her disappear past the gate, carrying my heart in her carry-on. The apartment felt cavernous without her. I wandered from room to room, touching things she'd touched, resisting the urge to text immediately. When my phone finally buzzed, it wasn't her. It was Claire. She wrote that she was back in town. She asked if we could talk. The message sat there, glowing, demanding a response. Outside, the last of the snow melted into the gutter, winter loosening its grip. I stood in the middle of the living room, phone in hand, knowing that whatever I did next would ripple outward, touching lives I could no longer pretend were separate. Claire suggested a cafe halfway between our old places, neutral ground like a ceasefire line. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, my hands wrapped around a mug I didn't want. The city looked newly washed, sidewalks slick and bright, as if winter had finally decided to let go. When she walked in, she scanned the room with the same careful attention she'd always had, like she was bracing for impact. She looked thinner. Or maybe I was seeing her differently now, through the lens of what I'd broken. We didn't hug. We smiled, the polite kind you give people you once knew intimately and now don't know how to reach. She asked how I was, and I said fine, because the word fit in my mouth even though it didn't belong there. She told me she'd moved into a smaller place, that she'd adopted a cat on a whim. I nodded, cataloging the facts, aware of the distance growing between each one. "I didn't come to reopen anything," she said eventually. "I came because I didn't want to imagine you as a villain." The honesty startled me. "I never wanted to be one," I said. "I know," she said. "That's the problem." We talked for an hour, not about Rowan, not directly. We talked about patterns, about how some endings are quieter than people expect, how sometimes the betrayal isn't the leaving but the staying too long after you've already gone. When we stood to leave, she touched my arm, brief and deliberate. "I hope you're brave," she said, not unkindly, "for everyone's sake." I walked home lighter and heavier all at once. Claire's grace felt like a gift I hadn't earned. I wanted to tell Rowan everything immediately, to prove transparency like it was a virtue I could still practice. Instead, I waited. I didn't know what shape the truth should take now that our rules had changed. Rowan texted that night from the airport back home. A picture of the lake, frozen and familiar, captioned with a single word, "landed." I replied with relief and an emoji that felt inadequate. We slid back into our rhythm, altered but intact. We didn't talk about the kiss. We talked around it, like you might circle a landmark you're not ready to visit yet. Days stretched. Then weeks. March arrived with a tentative warmth that made everyone reckless. Rowan called more often. The distance pressed in, no longer an abstraction but a fact with weight. She told me she'd accepted the job. I told her I was proud. Both things were true, neither was enough. "It doesn't mean I'm choosing away from you," she said quickly, as if she could hear the doubt in my silence. "It means I'm choosing something that matters to me." "I know," I said, and meant it. "I just don't know where that leaves us. We tried to define us, we failed. Every label felt either too small or too dangerous. We agreed not to pretend we were casual. We agreed not to make promises that required proximity we didn't have. The agreement felt fragile, like it depended on us not looking at it too closely. Then April brought a complication neither of us had anticipated. Her mother got sick. It wasn't dramatic at first. A diagnosis delivered with calm efficiency. A plan outlined in bullet points. Rowan said it like she was relaying someone else's news, her voice measured, controlled. I listened, asking the right questions, offering support in the only ways distance allows. After we hung up, I sat on the floor and cried in a way that surprised me with its intensity. The thought of her hurting somewhere I couldn't reach felt unbearable. The next weeks reorganized. Everything. Rowan became quieter, her attention pulled inward by fear and logistics. I tried not to demand space she didn't have. When she forgot to reply for hours, I told myself this was what patience looked like. When she canceled a call, I told myself love didn't keep score. One night, she called unexpectedly, her voice raw. She said she was tired of being strong. She said she didn't know how to let herself need anyone. I listened, my heart aching with the desire to show up physically, to do something tangible. You don't have to be alone, I said. I am though, she said softly. Here, with this, the words lodged in my chest. After we hung up, I stared at the ceiling until morning, the city waking up around me. I realized then that loving someone from afar is a kind of faith. You believe in the shape of them, even when you can't see it clearly. You believe your absence doesn't equal indifference. In May, she came back. It was supposed to be a short visit, a break between hospital shifts and work. When I met her at the airport this time, there was no hesitation. We hugged like people who'd been holding their breath underwater and finally surfaced. She smelled like travel and familiarity. The relief was immediate and sharp. She stayed with me again, the apartment welcoming her like it remembered. The rules were different now, unspoken but clear. We didn't avoid touch. We didn't rush it either. The intimacy was quiet, deliberate, built on trust that had been tested by distance and held. One evening we sat on the fire escape, legs dangling, watching the sun sink behind the buildings. She told me stories about her mother, small things that revealed more than the facts ever could. I told her about Claire, about the cafe, about the grace. Rowan listened, her face open. I don't want to be the reason you hurt someone, she said. You're not, I said. I made my choices. She nodded, accepting it without relief. I'm scared, she admitted, that if I lean into this I'll lose myself. I'm scared, I said, that if you don't you'll lose me. The honesty hung between us unsoftened. We didn't resolve it, we held it, the visit ended too soon. At the airport, she kissed me goodbye, unguarded now, a promise without words. I don't know what the right shape is, she said, but I don't want to pretend there isn't one. After she left, summer crept in. The city changed tempo. I tried to live inside the uncertainty without letting it hollow me out. Rowan's calls were steadier again, her mother's condition stabilizing, the job demanding but survivable. We planned another visit. We didn't plan a future. Then, in August, I got an email from my landlord. The building was being sold. The lease wouldn't be renewed. The news landed with a dull thud. I walked the apartment, touching walls, feeling the weight of accumulated moments. I thought of Rowan here, of the way the space had stretched to include her. I thought of the lake, frozen and waiting, of the job she'd chosen, of the life she was building that I was adjacent to but not inside. That night, I called her, she answered immediately, her voice warm. I told her about the apartment, about the timeline, about the way the city suddenly felt temporary. There was a pause on the line, the sound of her breathing. Come here, she said. The words were simple, the implications were not. I'm not asking you to decide tonight, she added quickly. I want you to consider it. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet, the city humming beyond the windows. The year was bending toward its final arc, the shape of it shifting again. I realized that every careful choice we'd made had led here, to a moment that demanded something braver than restraint. I opened my laptop and began to search for apartments in a town I'd only seen through her eyes, my heart pounding with the knowledge that wanting might finally require action. I didn't tell her right away that I'd started looking. I needed to sit with the wanting first, to make sure it wasn't just panic wearing hope's coat. September arrived with its thin light and sharpened edges, the city turning practical again after summer's indulgence. I packed books into boxes I hadn't labeled yet. I walked my usual routes like I was saying goodbye without telling anyone. At night, I imagined the lake thawed, imagined learning a place slowly, without demanding it become home on my terms. Rowan noticed the change in me before I named it. You're quieter, she said one evening, the screen between us glowing like a confession booth. But not the sad kind. I'm thinking, I said, which is dangerous. She smiled, then grew serious. I don't want you to move because you feel cornered. I know, I said. I don't want to either. We began to talk about logistics in the careful way people do when they're pretending the conversation is practical. Rent ranges, neighborhoods, commutes. We talked about boundaries like they were furniture we could rearrange if needed. We didn't talk about what would happen if it didn't work. We didn't need to, the fear sat with us anyway. A third presence neither of us tried to evict. Her mother's health dipped again in October, a sudden setback that pulled Rowan inward. The calls became shorter, more functional. I learned how to listen without fixing, how to offer steadiness instead of solutions. One night she said she was afraid of becoming someone whose life narrowed to caretaking and obligation. I told her that fear didn't make her selfish, it made her human. She cried then, quietly, the sound breaking through the speakers and lodging in my throat. I booked a visit without telling her first. It felt right to arrive rather than announce, to let my presence be the answer instead of my words. When I knocked on her door, she stared for a second like she'd misremembered the shape of me. Then she laughed, a short disbelieving sound, and pulled me inside. The apartment was small and warm, lived in a way that felt honest. I set my bag down and held her while she breathed, the world momentarily reduced to what we could touch. We didn't pretend the visit was a solution. We let it be what it was, a week carved out of uncertainty, an experiment in proximity without pressure. I went to the hospital with her once, sat in the waiting room with a book I didn't read. She squeezed my hand before going in and whispered, "Thank you," like it was a prayer. At night, we cooked simple meals and talked about nothing important. The quiet intimacy felt earned, the product of months of choosing each other without guarantees. On my last night, she stood at the sink washing dishes, her sleeves rolled up. "If you come," she said, not looking at me, "it won't be easy." "I know," I said. "I'm not good at asking for help. I know. I might fail you." I stepped closer, resting my chin on her shoulder. "We might fail each other," I said. "That's not the same as failing." She turned then, water dripping from her hands. "I don't want to be your only reason," she said. "You won't be," I said. "But you are one." When I left, it was harder than before because it felt like leaving something that had already begun. Back home, the move accelerated. I gave notice. I sold furniture. I told my sister, then Maya. Their reactions were a mix of excitement and concern, love tempered by realism. Claire texted once, a brief message wishing me well. I stared at it for a long time, grateful for the kindness that arrives late but still counts. December came quietly. Snow returned, softer this time, like it had learned restraint. I signed a lease with my name alone on it. I packed the last box and stood in the apartment one final time, listening to the echo. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. Rowan met me at the station, bundled against the cold. When she saw me, her face changed in a way that made the months before feel suddenly worth it. We hugged, long and unself-conscious, the kind of embrace that doesn't perform for anyone else. She helped me carry boxes up the narrow stairs, apologizing for the inconvenience of her life even as she made room for mine. Living together wasn't the montage people imagine. It was learning each other's rhythms, negotiating space, discovering the small irritations that don't make headlines but shape days. It was arguments that didn't escalate, apologies that came quicker than pride wanted. It was choosing not to disappear when things felt heavy. Her mother stabilized, then improved, the crisis easing into something manageable. The relief changed Rowan, softened her. One night, as we walked by the lake now frozen and gleaming under moonlight, she stopped and looked at me with a seriousness that stilled my breath. "I stayed," she said. "I don't mean the job or the town, I mean me. I stayed with this." I took her gloved hand. "I did too," I said. The year changed without ceremony. We watched the countdown on a muted screen, the numbers slipping past like a tide. When midnight arrived, there were no fireworks, just the quiet knowledge of where we were standing and who we were standing with. She kissed me, unhurried, and rested her forehead against mine. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "We'll find out," I said, "together if you want." She smiled then, the kind that reaches the eyes. "I want." Outside, snow fell in wide, patient flakes, settling into a new shape. If this story meant something to you, stay with us for the next one.